Hey everyone, welcome back to the channel. Today I'm going over my review of Warhammer 40K Boltgun, an awesome addition to the ever-expanding 40K video game library and an instant boomer shooter classic. Boltgun was developed by Auroch Digital, a UK-based studio, and published by Focus Entertainment, who has a solid record of putting out not only good 40K games, but good games in general, and both parties have done an excellent job with what's on offer here. The game itself is a new entry in the expanding genre known as boomer shooters, which are titles that feature gameplay and art styles reminiscent of old-school FPS classics like Doom and Quake. With fast-paced gunplay, pixelated graphics, and a brain-melting metal soundtrack, FPS enjoyers from back in the day, or anyone who's a fan of boomer shooters now, will definitely appreciate what the genre has to offer. And yes, if you're thinking 40K and Doom are a match made in heaven, you are absolutely right. Boltgun features a settings menu that offers a solid array of gameplay, audio, and graphic settings you can tweak to your liking. I especially appreciated being able to change the retro settings, allowing you to either tone down those aspects of the game or keep them cranked all the way up to 11 depending on personal preference. One thing I wish I had done at the start of my playthrough was turn on the toggle sprint option, instead of using press and hold. It may not be a big deal if you're playing on controller, but for me on mouse and keyboard, having to hold down shift to sprint was always distracting me from everything else I had to manage during the game's hectic firefights. And being able to press the button once and be done with it made the gameplay flow much smoother after I decided to switch it up. As far as performance goes, the game ran almost flawlessly for me on an i9-10900 and NVIDIA 3080 while capped at 144 FPS, which it should, considering the graphical style on display. I did experience one instance of some hefty frame drops during a particularly hectic battle, but one hiccup during my entire playthrough is definitely something I can live with. Before we get into the good stuff, which will make up the vast majority of this review, I did want to touch on the few bugs and glitches I experienced while playing. Most of the issues I ran into were audio related. Sometimes the music or sound effects would seem to randomly cut in and out. This was most obvious during one level while fighting your way through a Chaos Fortress in the Warp. These cutoffs seemed to trigger when I would move from one gameplay space to another, so that could have been the culprit, but I can't confirm for sure. Getting stuck on pieces of geometry, which happened most often while jumping during puzzle sections, would also trigger an ear-bleeding audio bug. Fortunately, this happened very rarely for me, but when it did, my eardrums took a serious beating. There was one hilarious collision bug that occurred during the Warp Fortress level I mentioned earlier, along with a couple AI pathing and geometry issues where enemies would get stuck on something, or not chase me down a flight of stairs and just stand at the top waiting for me to come to them. There was also one instance where a Chaos Terminator bugged out and just didn't see me, even while running around right next to him, but this only happened once, and none of these issues were anywhere near game-breaking. With no soft resets or hard crashes during my entire 11-hour playthrough, I gotta give Auroch their flowers for the impressive bug squashing and polish on display here. Boltgun's story is a continuation of the narrative started in another Warhammer 40K game that many fans will be quite familiar with, the well-respected Space Marine. As the player, you step into the heavily armored shoes of Malum Kaido, Sternguard veteran of the Ultramarines chapter, who has been tasked by the Ordo Malleus of the Inquisition to investigate a potential disturbance on the planet Graia, which has been under close supervision after the events of Space Marine took place several years prior. Kaido is voiced by Rahul Kohli. Many might know him from his roles in TV and film, but Kohli is also a huge video game and Warhammer 40K fan. During the recent Warhammer Skulls event that he hosted, it was revealed that he landed the Boltgun gig after expressing his excitement for the game on Twitter when it was revealed last year. The devs at Auroch noticed his tweets, which led them to reach out and acquire his voice acting services. Pretty neat. While Kaido isn't the most outspoken protagonist, Kohli does a great job with his performance, and when the Space Marine does speak, you, and all of the mutants and heretics you're cutting down, listen. While Kaido is a mostly silent protagonist, at least when he's not throwing out taunts to draw the enemy's attention, your floating servo skull companion, Incommodus, steals the show. This zippy floating head serves as your contact point with the leader of your mission, Inquisitor Cybele, and will provide brief introductions at the start of each level that help keep you abreast of your objectives as you move through the story. In addition to acting as your guide, Incommodus also has some truly fantastic dialogue that not only helps with role building and immersion, but is also truly hilarious at certain points, often in a way that only the rigid structure and religious fervor of the Adeptus Mechanicus in Warhammer 40K could provide. The art style on display in Boltgun will be one of the major draws for many players, and I can say with absolute certainty that the pixelated representation of the game's universe that's on display is incredible. From the depths of humanity's spaceships, to the industrial heart of Graia, to the insanity of the warp itself, at every turn Boltgun displays faithful and fantastic representations of 40K, and viewing the setting through this lens is just plain awesome. Every environment has been recreated in line with its original inspiration, and nothing is lost with the translation into Boltgun's pixel art. The changes in scenery between each biome are refreshing, and no details ever feel lost or quality degraded when seeing these spaces in the game's boomer shooter aesthetic. In fact, some aspects of the universe on display are simply stunning. In particular, the portions of the game featuring the warp and chaos corruption are absolutely breathtaking. and offer a completely new depiction of the infamous and terrifying force that is chaos in Warhammer 40K. Auroch knocked the game's audio design out of the park as well. Boltgun's voice acting and character sounds are incredibly well done. Even the grunts of surprise and death screams of your enemies sound right at home in the setting. Both ambient and combat soundtracks are perfect, no matter what part of the game you're exploring, or enemies you're shredding to pieces with your chainsword. Despite the deluge of sound effects, Boltgun's audio clarity is fantastic throughout. I had no trouble at all hearing enemies approach from behind, and was able to easily identify the exact type of foe I would be facing based on their sound design alone, even in the midst of hectic gunfights. Boltgun's gameplay also delivers in spectacular fashion, hitting a high bar of quality as both a boomer shooter and a 40K title that's faithful to the source material. I completed my entire playthrough on medium difficulty, and I can imagine the higher difficulties will pose quite a challenge based on some of the encounters I dealt with. While most of the game never felt overly challenging, there were definitely instances when I felt I wasn't making it out of an arena alive, and conquering a certain boss or group of enemies after dying to them was always a rewarding feeling. While not directly related to the game's difficulty, there was one instance where I became stuck in a particular sewer level when the game autosaved while I was low on health and being dumped into an arena full of enemies. And after trying to fight my way through and dying about 15 times, I had to resort to a frantic sprint straight past my enemies just to survive. Not very Space Marine of me, but it was a wake-up call to create some manual saves every so often, just in case. The main focus of the game is obviously its combat, which impresses at every turn. Both melee combat and ranged gunplay feel spectacular. Every weapon in your expansive arsenal, from your basic bolter to more powerful options like the Boltgun, Volkite Caliber, and Grav Cannon, think Doom's BFG, feels authentic and fun to use. My personal favorite was the heavy bolter, which sounds and feels exactly how I would envision it in the setting. The game also holds out on you, but in a good way. You don't get access to all of Boltgun's weapons until the second and third chapters. But when you do reach a new weapon in the late game, it comes at just the right time to inject some variety into your gameplay, and up your power fantasy a little bit as well. Mixing and matching your weapons to defeat specific enemies isn't a requirement, but it definitely makes things easier on you, and cycling through your massive armory during the game's frenetic combat sequences is a skill in its own right. The game's combat loop wouldn't be complete without a satisfying melee weapon, and Boltgun delivers on that front as well. Cleaving your enemies into bloody bits with your chainsword looks and feels just as satisfying as it sounds. Part of the enjoyment comes from lunging across vast distances as you bury your weapon into a target. And, in addition to your directional dash ability, you can use this melee lunge as a form of traversal as well. Grenades, both the frag and crack varieties, are satisfying and deadly to use. Mastering their trajectories and learning when to make use of them can provide a huge advantage in battle, especially when facing down large groups of enemies. One well-timed grenade can decimate an entire cluster of demons or Chaos Space Marines. Their sound design, along with the visceral visual feedback of turning clumps of enemies into red pixelated paste, never gets old. Boltgun also has plenty of hidden secrets scattered throughout each level for players to find. During my playthrough, I would scrounge up anywhere from 50 to 70% of power-ups in each level, and that was done while taking the time to search every nook and cranny. Or so I thought. While finding these power-ups is a fun little break from slaying traitors and demons in its own right, the benefits you gain by searching out these pickups make it well worth the effort. Whether it's a special Dragonfire magazine for your bolter, a heaping dose of contempt to keep your holy armor filled up, or a vortex grenade, think handheld nuclear bomb that can make even the most difficult boss encounters feel almost trivial. Each time you find and claim a power-up, you know some shit is going down the next time you run into a fight. Enemy variety is also on full display. During your jaunt across Graya and the game's other locales, you'll face off against a wide array of chaos-fueled enemies, ranging from corrupted cultists to Chaos Space Marines to demons of Nurgle and Tzeentch, all of which have their own unique combat styles, and all of which provide either health or contempt, aka armor pickups, upon their timely departure from the physical plane. Pink horrors will pelt you with warp fire from afar, and when you cut them down, 2 blue horrors will spring up to take their place. Nurglings will rush at you in the dozens, and sometimes it will feel like you are quite literally drowning in a sea of little farting demons. Different Chaos Space Marines also have different combat styles. Aspiring champions will charge at you relentlessly until you put them down, and I've personally found them to be some of the most difficult enemies in the game due to their sheer tenacity and aggression. There's a fair bit of variety in boss fights as well, although this is one of the few areas where I feel the game somewhat stumbles. Each boss you face is reused at least twice, sometimes more. And while they're all challenging in their own right, it can get a bit tedious to face off against the same enemies you've bested before in the later parts of the game. Still, despite some repetition, each of these enemies are extremely deadly, and provide a combat challenge that differs from the others. In fact, my first encounter with one left me hanging on to life with only a few bits of health and a couple bullets to my name after putting them in the dirt. Or banishing them back into the warp, I should say. Boltgun's level design is also quite impressive, not only in terms of the vast variety of locations you'll fight through, but also when it comes to the actual gameplay mechanics you'll deal with as you battle the forces of chaos. Even up until the last chapter, I was still being thrown into new environments and areas, and the game never felt stale or stagnant, like I was spending too much time in one biome before moving on to the next. Two arenas in particular stood out in terms of their creativity. The first was a giant elevator that you fought across as the platform climbed upwards, hopping off after each large battle to carve your way through corridors packed with enemies to locate a key that would allow you to continue climbing even higher. The second was a room with numerous ramps and platforms that you had to traverse while not only fighting enemies, but keeping track of the lava that slowly filled up the entire arena, forcing you to prioritize climbing over combat, which added even more urgency as you switched between mowing down enemies and identifying the next path upwards, while avoiding enemy gunfire and the creeping molten sludge below. In addition to direct confrontations with enemies, Boltgun also features traversal and puzzle sections that help break up the game's flow and provide some relief from constantly facing off against the hordes of chaos. While most of these puzzle sections felt unobtrusive, there was one in particular featuring a maze-like section filled with portals that dragged on for just a bit too long. That being said, the mix of straight-up combat and small puzzles kept the game moving along nicely, and I never felt bored or like I wasn't progressing quickly enough, which is another feather in Auroch's cap. After reaching the end of Chapter 1, I thought the game was close to being over. What a pleasant surprise then, that there was not only one, but two more chapters to play through, and I was delighted to have an excuse to spend more time with the game. Finally, I wanted to give the developers some additional kudos for the numerous details and callbacks to the Warhammer 40K setting, and even the tabletop game, that are present in Boltgun. From each of the weapons having its own strength rating, to aspiring champions occasionally being resurrected from the dead by their prescribed higher chaos power, just to meet another timely end at the tip of your chainsword, to the thematic power-ups scattered throughout each level, you can clearly see that the devs know and appreciate the source material, and they made every effort to show that off in-game. As someone who's been a 40K fan since middle school, back when I first discovered the joy of those little plastic army men you could put together, paint, and use to shoot your friends' little plastic guys too, I've always been keen to dive into that universe in the form of a good video game, and Boltgun certainly does not disappoint on that front. To sum things up, Boltgun is absolutely a game that's worth your time and money. For the low price of $22 you can experience a faithful adaptation of the 40K universe in stunning pixel art form, with electrifying and gore-filled combat, continuing a story that many fans of the franchise will already know and love. Even if you're not a 40K fan, and just a fan of the boomer shooter genre, or looking for a new FPS to try out, I can wholeheartedly recommend Boltgun as a title that will scratch any of those itches. Or for some lucky folks like myself, all of them at once. And, with a little Blood God teaser at the end of the game, you might want to get this one under your belt so if, or hopefully when, a sequel comes out, you'll be ready to jump right into the action. If you enjoyed this review, make sure to like and subscribe for more gaming content, and let me know if you did or didn't enjoy Boltgun in the comments below. Thanks for watching. You're a real one and I appreciate you. Catch you later, homies.